You just made a decision, not the decision you think you made, the one about whether to keep reading this or scroll past it. That's the surface decision. The real decision happened 3 seconds before you became aware of having any choice at all. Your nervous system detected something, ran it through pattern recognition systems operating far below conscious awareness, determined this stimulus was worth investigating, and generated the impulse that brought you here. You experienced this entire sequence as a spontaneous moment of curiosity, as if you were choosing. But the machinery was already running before you showed up to claim credit for the choice. This isn't philosophy. This is neuroscience. Benjamin Libet's experiments in the 1980s demonstrated that the brain initiates actions roughly 350 milliseconds before conscious awareness of the decision to act. Your subjective experience of choosing arrives after your nervous system has already committed to the action. The sensation of free will, of being the conscious author of your choices, is your brain's reconstruction of events that already occurred. You're watching a recording and believing it's live television. Most people never discover this. They spend entire lives believing they're the protagonist of their story, making conscious choices, directing their narrative, when actually they're spectators watching predetermined footage and narrating it after the fact. The voice in your head that claims to be making decisions is more like a sports commentator explaining plays that already happened. It creates the convincing illusion of authorship while having virtually no influence over what actually occurs. Here's what changes everything. The discovery that you're observing rather than authoring isn't the end of the investigation. It's the beginning, because there's a level beneath the automatic machinery, beneath the pattern recognition and unconscious processing, where actual authorship becomes possible. But accessing it requires understanding why the observer mode exists in the first place and what function it serves. Your brain's primary job isn't to make you happy or fulfilled or self-actualized. Its primary job is to keep you alive long enough to reproduce and protect offspring. Everything else is secondary. To accomplish this goal efficiently, your brain automates as much as possible. It creates patterns, habits, routines, default responses. It learns what worked before and repeats those patterns automatically. This is observer mode. You're running on autopilot most of the time, watching your automated patterns execute, experiencing the illusion of conscious choice. Observer mode is extraordinarily efficient for survival. You don't have to consciously decide to pull your hand away from something hot. You don't have to think through the mechanics of walking. You don't have to figure out how to speak your native language every time you open your mouth. Millions of complex processes run automatically, allowing your limited conscious bandwidth to focus on novel problems that actually require deliberate attention. The problem emerges when the automation extends beyond basic survival functions into domains where it actively prevents growth, change, and authentic expression. You automate emotional responses to certain people or situations. You automate the story you tell about who you are and what you're capable of. You automate your reactions to challenges, your approach to relationships, your patterns of self-sabotage. These automations were useful at some point, probably necessary for surviving specific circumstances in your past, but they keep running long after those circumstances changed, like software that never gets updated. In observer mode, you watch yourself react with the same anger to the same triggers. You watch yourself fall into the same relationship patterns. You watch yourself procrastinate on the same goals using the same justifications. You watch yourself make the same choices that produce the same results you claim you don't want. And the voice in your head provides sophisticated narratives explaining why this keeps happening, why change is difficult, why you're stuck. But that voice is just the commentator, narrating the replay, generating explanations for patterns that were already in motion. The transition from observing to authoring begins with a recognition that feels counterintuitive and slightly disturbing. You have to see through the illusion of conscious control without becoming paralyzed by determinism. You have to acknowledge that most of what you do is automated while simultaneously discovering the place where real choice exists. This is the razor's edge. Fall to one side, and you believe you're already in control, which prevents you from finding actual leverage. Fall to the other side and you believe you have no control, which becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Real authorship doesn't happen in the moment of action. That moment is already determined by everything that came before it. Real authorship happens in the space before patterns crystallize. It happens when you're aware enough to notice a pattern forming, but early enough in the process that you can influence which pattern takes hold. This is a much earlier point in the causal chain than most people realize. It's not about changing your behavior in the heat of the moment. It's about changing the conditions that make certain behaviors inevitable. Think about the last time you got triggered emotionally. Maybe someone said something that felt like criticism, and you immediately got defensive. In observer mode, you watch this happen and narrate it. They made me defensive by criticizing me. I had to defend myself. This narrative makes it seem like their action caused your reaction directly, like you had no choice. But there were actually dozens of decision points between their words and your defensive response. Your nervous system had to interpret their words as criticism. It had to categorize that criticism as a threat. It had to activate a defensive response as the appropriate counter to that threat. Each of these steps involved pattern matching against historical data, running automatically below conscious awareness. In author mode, you don't try to control your defensive reaction in the moment it's happening. That's already too late. Instead, you work at the level of the patterns themselves. You notice that you interpret certain types of feedback as criticism. You investigate why your system categorizes criticism as threat rather than information. You examine the historical data your pattern matching is using and update it with more recent relevant information. You don't fight with the defensive response. You change the conditions that make defensive response the inevitable output. This is uncomfortable work because it requires admitting that your automated responses, which feel absolutely true and justified in the moment, are actually just patterns inherited from past circumstances that may no longer apply. Your anger feels righteous. Your anxiety feels like accurate threat assessment. Your sadness feels like appropriate response to loss. But these are all automated patterns that could be running on outdated programming. The feelings are real. The patterns generating them may not be relevant to your current situation. The shift from observer to author requires developing what neuroscientists call metacognition, the ability to observe your own thinking processes. But it's a specific type of metacognition. It's not the voice in your head commenting on your thoughts. That's just more observation, more narration after the fact. Real metacognition is the capacity to notice when patterns are forming before they fully execute. It's catching the beginning of anger before the anger takes over. It's noticing the urge to procrastinate before procrastination becomes action. It's recognizing the defensive impulse before the defensive behavior launches. This noticing has to be fast. The window between pattern initiation and pattern execution can be less than a second. If you wait until you're already angry, already procrastinating, already defensive, you've missed the window. You're back in observer mode, watching the pattern complete and narrating explanations for why it was inevitable. The skill of authorship is developing the sensitivity to notice patterns in their infancy and the capacity to intervene at that early stage. Here's what most people miss about this process. You can't intervene through force or willpower. Trying to suppress an automated pattern once it's initiated just creates internal conflict. You end up fighting with yourself, which takes enormous energy and rarely succeeds long-term. Real intervention happens through understanding and updating. When you see clearly why a pattern exists, what function it served in the past, and how circumstances have changed, the pattern often dissolves on its own. Not because you forced it to stop, but because you updated the system with new information, and it naturally selects a more appropriate response. For example, if you have a pattern of people-pleasing that makes you say yes when you want to say no, you can't simply force yourself to say no. That creates massive internal resistance because the people-pleasing pattern exists for good reasons. Maybe saying yes kept you safe as a child. Maybe it was how you earned approval when other methods weren't available. Maybe it protected relationships you needed to survive. That pattern isn't irrational. It was highly rational given the circumstances that created it. Author mode means investigating those original circumstances with genuine curiosity rather than judgment. It means recognizing that child you developed people-pleasing as an intelligent adaptation to a specific environment. It means acknowledging that the pattern served you well and possibly saved you from worse outcomes. And then, crucially, it means updating the system with current data. You're not that child anymore. The people in your life now are different from the people then. The stakes have changed. The resources available to you have expanded. The pattern that was necessary then may be limiting you now. When you complete this investigation thoroughly, something interesting happens. The next time you're in a situation where the old pattern would typically activate, there's a moment of spaciousness. The pattern starts to initiate but doesn't have the same momentum. Your system has registered that circumstances are different and the old response may not be optimal. In that space, new possibilities become visible. You might still choose the old pattern, but now it's actually a choice rather than an automation. Or you might experiment with a different response and gather new data about what happens. This is authorship, not forcing change, not using willpower to override your nature, but creating the conditions where your nature can express more flexibly, more responsively, more appropriate to current circumstances rather than past ones. You're not fighting against your conditioning. You're updating it with better information and trusting your system to naturally select more optimal responses. The process accelerates as you develop sensitivity to your own patterns. You start noticing them earlier in their formation. You become familiar with the internal sensations that precede specific automated responses. Anxiety has a particular quality in your chest before it becomes full-blown anxious thinking. Anger has a specific heat in your body before it becomes aggressive action. Shutdown has a characteristic heaviness before it becomes complete withdrawal. These early warning signals are always there. You just weren't trained to pay attention to them. As you learn your own signals, intervention becomes possible at earlier and earlier points in the causal chain. Eventually, you can catch patterns so early that it's not really intervention anymore. It's more like participation in the system's decision-making process. Your conscious awareness isn't overriding the unconscious machinery. It's providing additional data the machinery can use to select more appropriate responses. You become a collaborative author rather than either a passive observer or a controlling dictator. This changes everything about how you experience life. Situations that used to trigger automatic reactions start feeling more spacious. You have time to respond rather than just reacting. Relationships that felt stuck in repetitive patterns begin shifting as you stop executing your half of the pattern automatically. Challenges that seemed insurmountable become approachable because you're not running automated defeat responses before you even start. You're still the same person with the same history and conditioning, but you're accessing previously locked degrees of freedom in how you respond to circumstances. The social implications are profound. Most human interaction is just automated patterns triggering other automated patterns. You run your defensive pattern, which triggers someone else's attack pattern, which reinforces your defensive pattern, which escalates their attack pattern, until you're both locked in a predictable dance that neither of you consciously chose. Both people are in observer mode, watching their patterns execute, narrating justifications for why the other person made them respond this way. Nobody is authoring anything. Everyone is just watching predetermined footage and claiming they had no choice. When you shift to author mode, you stop participating in these unconscious dances. Someone runs their pattern at you, but you don't automatically run your complementary pattern back. There's space. You can see their pattern clearly without being pulled into the choreography. This breaks the loop. Without your half of the pattern executing on cue, their pattern has nothing to bounce off. It either escalates temporarily as they try to force the familiar dance, or it dissolves as they register that something different is happening. This doesn't mean you become passive or allow harmful behavior. It means your responses become conscious and strategic rather than automated and reactive. You can set boundaries without the charge of reactivity. You can defend yourself without the blindness of defensiveness. You can confront problems without the escalation of aggression, because you're authoring your responses based on current circumstances rather than executing patterns from past circumstances. Children are extraordinary at detecting whether adults are in author mode or observer mode, though they wouldn't use these terms. They can sense when an adult is responding to them consciously versus reacting from automated patterns. When an adult is in observer mode, reactive and running patterns, children either try to manipulate those patterns to get what they want, or they reflect the adult's reactivity back at them. When an adult is in author mode, present and responsive, children typically meet them there. They become more regulated, more cooperative, more willing to engage authentically. The same principle applies to all relationships. People unconsciously mirror the mode you're operating in. If you're in observer mode, running patterns and reacting automatically. They'll either run complementary patterns with you, or they'll try to wake you up through confrontation. If you're in author mode, present, and consciously responsive, they'll tend to match that presence. Not always immediately, and not everyone. But the shift is noticeable. Relationships that felt stuck begin moving. Communication that felt circular starts going somewhere. Conflicts that seemed unsolvable find new angles of approach. Perhaps most importantly, the transition from observer to author changes your relationship with failure and success. In observer mode, success feels like something that happens to you when circumstances align favorably, and failure feels like something that happens when circumstances don't cooperate. You're not responsible for either, really. You're just watching your patterns play out in different environments and narrating the results. This creates a weird mix of arrogance when things go well, I'm naturally talented at this, and helplessness when things go poorly, circumstances prevented my success. In author mode, both success and failure become feedback rather than verdicts. An approach worked or it didn't. The patterns you selected produced the results they produced. That information updates your system, making future selections more accurate. There's less attachment to being right and more interest in discovering what's effective. There's less fear of being wrong, because wrong just means you gathered data about what doesn't work, which is necessary information for finding what does work. This creates a fundamentally different trajectory through life. Observer mode keeps you running the same patterns, getting similar results, narrating explanations for why change is difficult or impossible. The trajectory is predictable because the patterns are automated. Author mode keeps you updating patterns, experimenting with new responses, gathering data about what works in current circumstances. The trajectory is less predictable because you're actively participating in its creation rather than passively watching it unfold. The transition isn't binary. You don't flip a switch and suddenly become a full-time author while previously being a full-time observer. It's more like a gradual increase in the percentage of your life you're consciously authoring versus passively observing. Maybe you start at 5% authorship, 95% observation. You notice one pattern, update it, create some new degrees of freedom in that domain. Now you're at 10% authorship. You expand to another pattern, then another. The ratio gradually shifts. What's fascinating is that as your authorship percentage increases, the quality of your observation improves as well. You become better at seeing your own patterns because you're not as identified with them. You can watch them with curiosity rather than justification. This creates a positive feedback loop. Better observation enables more effective authorship. More effective authorship creates more space for clearer observation. The cycle accelerates your development in both capacities. Eventually, you reach a point where the distinction between observing and authoring becomes less relevant. You're doing both simultaneously. You observe your patterns with clarity while authoring your responses with intention. The observer isn't separate from the author. They're two aspects of the same aware presence engaging with life consciously rather than automatically. This is what integration looks like. Not the elimination of observation or the constant burden of authoring everything, but a fluid collaboration between the two modes that allows you to be both spontaneous and intentional, both responsive and directive. The question isn't whether you'll keep observing your life or start authoring it. You'll do both. The question is whether you'll do them consciously or unconsciously. Whether you'll watch your automated patterns execute while believing you're making choices, or whether you'll see the patterns clearly and participate in updating them. Whether you'll narrate predetermined footage or actually influence what gets filmed. The machinery is running either way. The only question is whether you're going to understand how it works well enough to have any real input into what it produces. This is the moment. Not some future moment after you've read more books or taken more courses or finally figured yourself out completely. This moment, right now, where you notice you're reading these words and something in you is responding. Is this response automatic or conscious? Are you observing from pattern or authoring from presence? Can you tell the difference? Can you feel the space between stimulus and response where actual choice lives? That space is always there. You just have to learn to recognize it. And recognition begins now, with whatever pattern is active in this present moment, ready to be seen clearly for the first time. Let's make this concrete. Your phone just buzzed with a notification. In observer mode, you watch yourself reach for it automatically. The hand moves before you consciously decided anything. You check the notification, maybe respond, maybe get pulled into a 15-minute scroll session. Later, you narrate this as, "I just wanted to check that message," or "I needed a break," creating the story of conscious choice after the automated pattern already executed. The whole sequence happened on autopilot, while your narrating consciousness provided justification after the fact. In author mode, the same buzz occurs, but there's a split-second awareness before the hand moves. Not thinking about whether to check it, not deliberation, just awareness that the pattern is initiating. In that awareness, space opens. Maybe the hand still moves toward the phone, but now you're actually present for the choice rather than watching the automation execute. Maybe you notice the impulse and consciously decide to finish the paragraph you're reading first. Maybe you recognize this is the 7th time in an hour you've checked your phone and decide to investigate why this pattern is running so frequently. The difference isn't necessarily in the action. It's in the presence of awareness at the decision point rather than narration after the decision already happened. This phone example might seem trivial, but it represents every automated pattern you're running. The person who triggers irritation in you, the task you chronically avoid, the food you eat when you're not hungry, the words you say to yourself when you make a mistake, the way you hold your body when you're anxious, the story you tell about why your life is the way it is. Each of these involves the same structure. Pattern initiates automatically, executes without conscious involvement, then gets narrated as if it was chosen. The phone is just the most obvious example because the automation is so visible once you start paying attention. Your sleep patterns reveal this dynamic clearly. You tell yourself you'll go to bed at 10. 10 o'clock arrives and you watch yourself scroll social media for another hour. In observer mode, this gets narrated as, "I wasn't tired yet," or "I just needed to unwind," or "I lost track of time." These narratives make it seem like the behavior was chosen, but it wasn't. A pattern activated, you watched it execute, and your conscious mind generated an explanation that preserves the illusion of intentional action. In author mode, you notice the pattern earlier in its formation. You feel the impulse to pick up your phone at 10 o'clock instead of going to bed. You recognize this impulse as a pattern rather than a genuine need. You investigate what function this pattern serves. Maybe it's avoiding the vulnerability of lying in bed with your thoughts. Maybe it's the only time you feel you have control over your schedule. Maybe it's just a deeply ingrained habit with no current function. Understanding the pattern changes your relationship with it. You're not fighting the urge to scroll. You're seeing clearly what generates the urge and making a conscious decision about whether to honor it. The work domain shows this distinction in high relief. You have a project that matters to you, but you watch yourself procrastinate on it repeatedly. Observer mode narrates this as lack of motivation, poor time management, or waiting for the right moment. These explanations make procrastination seem like something happening to you rather than something you're doing. But procrastination is an active pattern. Your system is choosing lower stakes activities over higher stakes ones for specific reasons. Maybe the project triggers performance anxiety. Maybe completing it means you'll have to face the next scary challenge. Maybe unconscious perfectionism makes starting feel overwhelming. The pattern isn't irrational. It's serving a protective function, probably one that was necessary at some point in your history. Author mode means getting curious about what your procrastination is protecting you from, not judging it, not trying to force yourself past it through willpower, but genuinely investigating the underlying concerns driving the pattern. When you see clearly what the pattern is protecting you from, you can address those concerns directly. Maybe you need to reduce the stakes somehow. Maybe you need to separate completion from identity. Maybe you need to acknowledge the fear and proceed anyway. The specific intervention varies, but it comes from understanding the pattern rather than fighting with it. And when you work at this level, procrastination often dissolves naturally. Not because you forced it away, but because you updated the system with information that makes a different response more adaptive. Relationships offer the most complex arena for this transition. Every close relationship involves intricate dances of automated patterns. You have your patterns. They have their patterns. The patterns trigger each other in predictable sequences. You watch these dances unfold and narrate them as, "They always do this," or "I can't help reacting when they say that," or "We just don't communicate well." These narratives obscure the reality that both people are running automations and neither is authoring their participation in the interaction. Take a common pattern. One person withdraws, the other pursues. The pursuer reaches out, gets rejected, tries harder. The withdrawer feels pressured, retreats further, needs more space. The pursuing intensifies, the withdrawal deepens. Both people are in observer mode, watching their patterns execute, narrating why the other person's behavior justifies their response. The pursuer, I have to reach out because they're shutting me out. The withdrawer, I have to retreat because they're smothering me. Neither recognizes they're in an automated dance. Both believe they're responding consciously to the other's behavior. When one person shifts to author mode, the entire dynamic can change. Let's say the pursuer develops awareness of their pursuing pattern. They notice the urge to reach out, text again, seek reassurance. Instead of automatically executing this pattern, they pause. They investigate what drives this need to pursue. Maybe it's fear of abandonment. Maybe it's unworthiness that requires constant validation. Maybe it's an old adaptation to an emotionally unavailable parent. Understanding the source doesn't eliminate the urge, but it creates space around it. The pursuer can feel the urge to reach out without immediately acting on it. They can recognize their partner's withdrawal isn't about them. They can choose to give space, not because they're suppressing their need, but because they're seeing clearly that pursuing has never actually created the connection they want. When the pursuing pattern stops executing automatically, the withdrawal pattern has nothing to bounce off. The withdrawer's system expects the pursuing to escalate and has prepared defensive responses. But those responses aren't needed. The pressure isn't there. This creates a strange opening. The withdrawer might initially escalate their withdrawal, confused by the absence of the expected pattern. But if the pursuer maintains their author mode presence without slipping back into automation, something new becomes possible. The withdrawer might cautiously re-engage. Not because they were convinced through pursuing, but because the absence of pressure allows organic reconnection. This doesn't mean all relationships can be fixed by one person shifting to author mode. Sometimes patterns are so deeply entrenched or so fundamentally incompatible that awareness alone can't bridge the gap. But the shift from observing to authoring at least makes clear what's actually happening rather than what you're narrating about what's happening. You might discover the relationship itself was an automated pattern, chosen not from authentic connection, but from unconscious programming about what relationships should look like or who you should be with. That discovery, while painful, is valuable information that can redirect your trajectory towards something more authentic. The transition from observer to author affects how you process difficult emotions. In observer mode, emotions happen to you. You're sad, and sadness seems like an external force that overtook you. You're angry, and anger feels like a justified response to someone else's behavior. You're anxious, and anxiety appears to be accurate assessment of genuine threats. These emotions are real. The way you relate to them determines whether they run you or you work with them skillfully. In author mode, you recognize emotions as information generated by your pattern matching system. Sadness indicates loss or disappointment. Anger signals boundary violation or blocked goals. Anxiety suggests perceived threat or uncertainty. These signals aren't arbitrary. They're your system's interpretation of circumstances based on historical data and current conditions. But they're interpretations, not facts. And interpretations can be examined. When you feel anxious about an upcoming presentation, observer mode narrates this as, "The presentation is making me anxious," or "I'm bad at presentations." This narrative treats anxiety as either caused by external circumstances or as revealing truth about your identity. Author mode notices anxiety arising and gets curious. What specifically is the threat my system is detecting? Am I afraid of being judged, of failing, of succeeding, of being visible? Each of these involves different underlying patterns and requires different interventions. By investigating the source rather than just experiencing the symptom, you can address the actual pattern generating the anxiety. This doesn't mean anxiety disappears. The pattern might have deep roots and legitimate reasons for existing, but your relationship with the anxiety changes. Instead of being overtaken by it, you're working with it as information. You can feel anxious and still give the presentation. You can acknowledge the fear and investigate whether the perceived threat is accurate to current circumstances or based on outdated data. You're authoring your response to the emotion rather than just observing the emotion run you. Physical sensations operate through the same dynamic. You have chronic tension in your shoulders. Observer mode narrates this as stress, aging, or just how your body is. Author mode notices the tension and investigates what pattern is creating it. Maybe you're literally carrying responsibility you feel unable to set down, and your body is expressing this through held tension in the muscles that actually carry things. Maybe you're bracing against vulnerability, creating armor in your upper body. Maybe you're holding your breath habitually, and the shoulder tension is compensatory. Understanding what generates the pattern often allows the body to release what it's holding, not through force or stretching, but through addressing the underlying reason the holding pattern exists. Your relationship with time shifts dramatically in this transition. Observer mode experiences time as something that happens to you. Days pass, years accumulate, and you narrate your journey through time as if you're a passenger watching landscape scroll by. Author mode recognizes that your experience of time is largely determined by your state of consciousness. When you're running automated patterns, time feels like it disappears. Hours vanish into scrolling or rumination or busy work that doesn't matter. When you're present and authoring your experience, time becomes spacious. Minutes contain depth. Moments feel full rather than rushed. This isn't mysticism. It's attention. Automated patterns don't require conscious attention, so consciousness is free to wander into rumination about past or anxiety about future. This creates the subjective experience of time passing quickly without much actual living happening. When you're authoring your experience, conscious attention is engaged with what's actually occurring. More information is processed, more nuance is perceived, more of your capacity is active. This creates subjective sense of time expanding because you're actually present for it rather than running patterns that don't require your conscious participation. The implications extend into how you approach goals and aspirations. In observer mode, you watch yourself want things but not move toward them. You narrate this as lack of motivation, discipline, or the right circumstances. You make plans that don't get executed, you set goals that don't get reached, and the explanatory narratives preserve the sense that you're trying to make things happen even as patterns of avoidance or self-sabotage execute automatically. Author mode reveals that motivation isn't something you wait for, it's something that emerges from a